There's an actual equation when you're analyzing properties. And basically, even if you're managing it yourself, even if you're doing the maintenance yourself and everything, you want to take off 10% for property management costs. You want to take off 5% for maintenance costs. And you want to take off roughly, for my area and most other areas, 3% for vacancy is probably fine. So that has you at around 18% of your gross rent. If you can keep that out of your gross rent and still cash flow, that's a great property.
Welcome back to the Prospecting Show. Today is June 15th, and we have Spencer Gatten on the show. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thanks. So to kind of start things off, everybody who listens to the show knows we do three things. We have the past, the present, and the future. So to kind of start off with your background, where'd you come from? And tell us a little bit about how you got to where you're at right now.
Yeah, so I've actually, funny enough, I came across somebody recently who had a similar background story to me, but started off actually in acting, which is not generally very business related, but that's where I started. I first moved out to Vancouver and I was like, oh, I'm going to be an actor. I dropped out of university for it. And I was like, this is the plan. This is the easy way to do it. I'm just doing this. I'm going to be famous. So what ended up actually happening is I moved out to Vancouver and I ended up meeting with a pretty big agent out there. And he was like, okay, I'll give you the lowdown. You have no experience. You have no reel. You have no photos. You have no anything. And you're expecting to get into acting. And I was like, yeah, it's easy, right? And then he's like, no, but he's like, you've got potential, but you're from Ontario anyways, and you're from Toronto. He's like, why don't you go do this in Toronto? Why don't you get started there where it makes sense? You're closer to family. He's like, you can get some experience and then kind of break into the market from there. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, I'm kind of just living in Vancouver for nothing. I guess I'll move out to Toronto again. And so I moved out to Toronto and then I got my first agent and actually started getting some auditions pretty quickly, which I was excited about. And in my first year, I actually got a few bookings, but there was nothing that was like kind of that breakout role. And I was kind of paycheck to paycheck with my day job. And then with the acting, it was really not enough to go full time at all. And what ended up happening is steam started to pick up in the acting career. My agent actually quit. He just left the industry entirely. So I was just like, okay, I just got started, I just got momentum and then my agent's quitting. Great. And so he left and then I ended up on a search for a new agent and that took a few months. So then I had no acting money coming in, no auditions. And I was basically burning through my savings and everything like that. And I was just like, I was always had financial pressures and that was always weighing on me pretty heavily because it's like, I want to follow what would be, at the time I'm going, this is my dream and this is what I want to do. It still is, but I want to follow this, but how do I do it sustainably? So sure. I ended up moving out of Toronto. I was like, I'll work for a few years. Like I'll take a pause on acting. And it's so funny. I kept setting these arbitrary numbers of like, I just need to save $10,000 and then I can move back to Toronto and I can just audition again and it's easy. And I was just like, what a random choice of number. There was no actual logic behind it. But then I got kind of into the workforce and I was always like, oh, okay, I was pursuing acting for that time and I never had a fail safe. I never had a background of like, okay, what happens if I pursue this for 40 years and nothing happens? I know I enjoy it, but what happens in 40 years? Right. Because I've got nothing to show for it. I've got no retirement. I've got no savings. I've got no anything. I'll be paycheck to paycheck for 40 years. So I was like, how can I make money? So I did the classic how to make money online Google search and then ended up in like a few different avenues. Of course, like you always get the high SEO ones like day trading and all these other like business
Forex
gurus
and all
Forex
Bitcoin,
and blah blah Bitcoin,
Nigerian prince scam.
Yeah, so I was like, okay, these are good, quick get rich quick schemes. That's awesome. And so I kind of just ended up looking through and what I found was no matter which lane I took, it always ended in real estate. So even like the traders would always say, oh, 10% of my portfolio is also real estate. Even people who had nothing to do directly with real estate, I always kind of found that was the common denominator between all of the investing. And then I came across a statistic, which is 90% of millionaires have become that through real estate. And it makes sense, especially now, like being this heavily involved in the real estate industry. I see why this is like, it's such an achievable dream once you're actually involved with it.
Right.
So I kind of just kept going and I was just working. I had a really low salary job. My job was paying me $30,000 a year and I was working full time for $30,000 a year. So it's like, I was not making bank or anything like that. So I'm like, okay, I'm not saving any money at this job here, but I'm also looking at it as a learning time. I was like, sure. Okay, it was a low stress job. So I was like, okay, I don't take work home with me. I can can just focus on learning, and ended up doing more and more research on real estate, where I started just getting into real estate podcasts. And then I just hammered real estate podcasts. Like, no joke, I'm in the thousands of hours, like multiple thousands of hours of real estate podcasts. I've listened to pretty much like most of the Canadian ones that were available. And then I was doing all the American ones. Like, there's a really good one that I got started with, which I like, and his name's Rod Cleef. I don't know if you've come across him at all. He's from Florida, and he actually had a really cool story. So he was a really successful real estate investor and then got wiped out in 2008. He lost $50 million in 2008. And so he had to start pretty close to fresh. Like, his apartment buildings had stayed, but he lost all his single family. And so I started listening to his, and he got me like really kind of motivated. And then there was this Canadian podcast, and I came across a real estate investor who was local, and he had a really cool story. It was similar to mine. He was a small town kid, grew up with a family with not a lot of money. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to reach out to him. And I did. And he was a good fit from a coaching perspective at that time in my life. And I worked with him for 3 years, and that's kind of what launched my real estate investing business. And he had started from nothing, and he got up to over 200 units at his peak.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, well, that's what I want to do. I want to have 200 units. So I'll work with this guy and blah, blah, blah. So it was a good fit at the time for sure. So that's kind of how I got into the real estate investing business. And I just fell in love with real estate at the time. And I was like, okay, if I'm literally spending all of my free time that I'm not working day jobs on real estate investing, why am I not just working as a realtor and making it also my day job? So
sure. And what do you think, like, now that you talk about that division, right? The division of, here's my day job, here's the portfolio, right? Everybody ending at that same point in real estate. Do you think that working in real estate as your day job has made it easier for you? Is it just that you're closer to it? Is it a better vehicle to actually get into investment opportunities? Like, what's the benefit of doing the real estate job as the day job, and the investor as like the side job?
I think the benefit is going to depend on what business you want to start as a realtor. If you want to be an investment focused realtor and you're working with other investors who are in your area, they kind of bleed into each other a little bit. So it becomes a bit more difficult, because now, I want to buy that property, but my client's also interested in that property. And then you kind of like, you're a competitor with your clients, and it's like an awkward dynamic, and you've got to run everything by them. So in that sense, it's not the best fit. But where I find it is a great fit is you just get so strong in your negotiation skills and kind of like maneuvering the deals and learning about real estate overall, that it's going to help your investing model. So what I find, and I'm kind of trying to focus on a bit more, is focus with the residential home buyers, and then focus on investing. That's my business separately. So I don't have to worry about competing with the residential home buyers for one of my investment properties.
On the investment property side, is it single family, multifamily? What's the actual model there?
So everything has been either multifamily or single family to be converted into multifamily, just because multifamily is just the way to go from a cash flow perspective. When you want to grow a real estate portfolio, it's pretty tough to grow it exclusively on single family. The cash flow is just so tight there. And a lot of people don't like, funny enough, my new YouTube video is about is cash flow specifically, because that's where a lot of people, when they're growing, they don't realize that there's a bunch of other expenses that you need to factor in, because most people they'll take the simple number of, my cash flow is minus my mortgage, minus my taxes, and minus my insurance. The rest is cash flow.
Right.
Well, that's not true, because you have so many other things that you need to worry about. Because when that property goes vacant and you have to repaint it and you have to refloor it and get the kitchen done, you have to pay for those somehow. Well, what you've been doing the whole time, if you've built it into your model, is you've been taking that as a certain percent with your maintenance and vacancy. So 8% of your gross rent over the 3 years that they rent there, you should have a nest egg at the end that is built up in that account where you don't actually have to pay any money out of pocket. Right. And if you design your model like that, you can grow infinite amount of properties, because hopefully if you've done it properly, like, you're not paying for every property. When the maintenance is being done, the money's in the account. So you don't have to pay for it out of pocket.
Got it. And when people are starting off, especially with your experience, do you find that the scalability can be linear? Like, do people learn at the same rate and say, okay, I got one property and I'm going to get a second property? A lot of the portfolios that I've seen are kind of exponential, where it's like, I got one property this year, I got 3 next year, and then the year after that, I got 17 or something. Like, you see these kind of, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or anything from Kiyosaki or any of those guys, they all talk about the portfolio over time, and it changes substantially just within a 5-year period of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that happen? Is that realistic? Is that something that you see happening yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the hardest one by and large, number one, because you're learning everything on number one. And then you also probably are going to make a mistake on number one unless you're working with a mentor of some sort or a realtor who's very involved in the industry and
Somebody who's
very
done it
educated in it.
before. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the first one is the hardest. After you've bought three, buying 9 in 1 year doesn't seem as daunting because you've probably experienced enough during the ownership of those three. Because to have three properties, you need to have a handyman who you're able to call, and you need to have like a leasing agent unless you're going to be renting it all yourself and running it all. But ideally, you want to learn all these jobs, but you also want to be prepared to delegate all of these jobs, because if you're planning on buying 9, you can't do all of the work yourself. It's
Right.
impossible. Well, I'm pretty handy. I could probably fix the floor and do all that stuff. It's like, are you going to do 9 properties floors? And if all 9 of those properties have 2 units, are you going to do all of those floors? Like, you're
Right.
not going to do that. So you need to build the model so that you can buy those 9, but you're generally learning it over those first couple of years that you're buying
Sure.
the smaller amounts.
Sure. And with your experience and kind of what you're seeing right now, how do you set up a model that makes sense in the multifamily space where you're able to make money from it, but then also cover these other expenses like having a leasing agent, like having, associated costs with the mortgage, like all these other ancillary costs like fixing, rehab, like whatever it is. How do you account for that and the numbers associated with it?
So you always need to buy for cash flow. Never buy for appreciation, never buy for any of these other like, oh, that's where you make all that money if you flip it, oh, because that's not the first question I always get when I say I'm a real estate investor is people always say, oh, you're a house flipper. And I'm like, no, I actually own a portfolio and blah, blah, blah. And then I have to explain the difference. But when you're buying for cash flow first, you can make whatever number is going to make sense for you in your market. So some people are able to cash flow $250 a door. And that's like, okay, you got a fourplex that's cash flowing you $1,000 a month. That's great. If you've got that level of cash flow, you're not going to have to pay for anything out of pocket on that property, any repairs, anything like that.
Right.
But in a market like mine, where it has appreciated so heavily and the prices have increased so quickly, you do have to adjust your cash flow number so that it makes sense. Because so I could calculate my properties on, oh, each one of these doors cash flows $250. But what I actually do is I calculate it on each one of these doors cash flows $150, because that extra $100 goes straight to the account for that's my vacancy, my maintenance, and all that. And that's
Right.
on a per door basis. So on a duplex, that would be $200 and whatever. So, and you have that built in, but there's an actual equation when you're analyzing properties. And basically, even if you're managing it yourself, even if you're doing the maintenance yourself and everything, you want to take off 10% for property management costs. You want to take off 5% for maintenance costs. And you want to take off roughly, for my area and most other areas, 3% for vacancy is probably fine. So that has you at around 18% of your gross rent. If you can keep that out of your gross rent and still cash flow, that's a great property, because it doesn't really matter how much it cash flows from that point on, because you know that all of your costs are taken care of. You're never having to put personal cash into that property.
Got it. And so for people who are going to actually make money with it, right, beyond just, hey, we're not going to lose money, right, which is kind of what you're talking about, how does that develop over time? Is it that you need lots of properties? Is it that you need to take equity back out to buy the net? Like, how do you actually leverage that so that you can cash flow and ultimately remove yourself from, a JOB, right? Like, how do you actually get to that point?
So to get to that point, you definitely need to, as you said, like a lot of people will run out of their down payments very quickly. Not a ton of people have $1 million liquid where they can go buy 10 properties. So the best scenario for that is to always try and find properties that you can buy that are, let's say you need some sort of rehab or under market value. Like for me, it's a little bit tougher as a realtor. I can't buy a lot of off market deals. There's a lot more regulations with that.
Right.
But as a private investor, you can buy stuff off market for, let's say if the property was going to sell for 200,000, but you got a private deal for 175,000, you've already built in $25,000 in equity there. That's going to mean a lot when it comes to the refinance, right? So all real estate is long-term. So to get out of your JOB, you're still not going to do it in year one, regardless of if you're a super genius. It's just like by time you've bought the properties and turned them over and all that stuff, it's still going to take time. So, and well, I mean, some people do it with flipping. I'm just talking about like the buy and hold portfolios. But the thing with the buy and hold is you always are going to be leveraging your property so you can continue to grow that portfolio. So what we've done, a perfect example is a deal that's finishing up right now. We bought a single family home. we paid to have it renovated and put in a basement suite. So we turned it into a duplex. Well, it created a huge wedge of equity. So what we were able to do is refinance that property and take out all of our investment, take out all of our renovation costs, and then even we took out $20,000 in tax-free profit. So that property actually paid us money to own, and then we'll take all of that same equity that we had and rinse and repeat. And that
Right.
strategy is called the Burr Strategy, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, which is the buy, renovate, rent, and refinance and repeat. And the reason that that's such a great, like it's the fastest way to wealth, because if you only have $100,000 to invest or even a smaller amount, it's the way that you can buy 10 properties with that same
Yeah,
initial
it's
investment.
really leverage, right? I mean, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, there's nowhere else in the marketplace that you can take, like you said, $1,000 and basically leverage 5x that, right? Or even 10x. In the US, the smallest down payments, on like an FHA or some of these specialty loans could be 3%, right? You can leverage whatever the math is on that 35 times your income immediately, right? On any given deal, because you can go mortgage the rest of it. Now, is that the ideal situation? Probably not. But if it flows, it really shouldn't matter, right? Because you can go put $1,000 down and then go leverage the other 35 immediately.
Well, and that's what I always try to say to people is like, especially people starting out, house hacking is one of the best ways to grow your portfolio from the start, because you can get into your first property for such a cheap amount of money. Because even if, like you said, 3%, well, if you buy a $400,000 fourplex, that's $12,000.
Right.
That's all you need to get into the property. And now you have a fourplex that you can move into. So now you've moved into it. So your cost of living is super low. But what the ideal thing is to do, it would be, if you're house hacking, it's move into the units, kind of renovate them, turn them over. So now that fourplex that you bought for $12,000 at the end of the year is worth $500,000 because you've increased the cash flow so high and you've renovated the units. Well, now you can refinance and leverage that same money to start over again, right?
Right.
With
Right.
whatever. Like ideally, you want something with a bit more of equity, because if you refinance at the 500,000, that 20%, it's only taking out the 400. But
Yeah.
that's like the principle of how you're able to get in for such a low amount of money and refinance and get that money right back to you.
That's a really good point. I think the other thing in the US, I don't know if there's the equivalent in Canada, but a 1031 exchange, a lot of people end up doing in the US, which is
Oh
seems like a great opportunity, because you can buy a duplex, go through the whole Burr method, go to refinance it, take the money back out, and then basically upgrade to something more expensive with the deferred tax option, right?
Well, that's actually the power of the refinance, regardless of the 1031 exchange, is you don't pay taxes on a refinance. So let's say you bought a house for $200,000 and in a couple of years it's worth $400,000, and then you refinance, you take out 320. You don't pay taxes on that $120,000 because it's considered a liability, the mortgage.
Right.
So that's the other benefit of refinancing versus selling a property, because when you refinance, that's now a liability, but you can use it to invest. But you pay zero tax on that $120,000. So if you sold that property, you would take out $200,000, but then you pay taxes on it. So you might only walk away with 150 after
Right.
taxes. Or you can refinance and take out the 120, still own the property, have it pay you cash flow. Because ideally, if you're trying to leave the job, you want the cash flow to keep compounding. And when you
Right.
sell a property, you get rid of all that cash flow, but you
Right.
want to keep that cash flow for the next one. So if each property only cash flows $300, okay, well, to cover my costs and my expenses, I need 10 properties to cash flow $300. That's $3,000 a month. And now that at least covers my cost of living.
Sure.
So I don't need a job anymore. Yeah, you're not like retiring extravagantly with that, but at least you're protected. So people always ask, well, how much cash flow is good cash flow? There's no number. It's what makes sense for your lifestyle and what you have for your plans. So basically, if you want to have $100,000 retirement plan, then do the reverse math on how many properties you need to get to $100,000 in cash flow.
Right.
So
And that's assuming that you're just talking about the cash flow. That's not even taking into consideration the fact that you have a buy and hold that ultimately could be a sell, right? You might dump a property and take the cash back out of that at some point, right? So there's some equity built in there. Not that you should buy homes for equity. I mean, sometimes people would do that, I guess, right on a flip. But I mean, if you can cash out immediately at the end, it's probably better than sitting in like a IRA or a RRSP or RESP or whatever the Canadian equivalents are, right? It's more liquid, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it, especially if you grow really quickly at the start and you get to 15 properties really quick. Well, if in 5 years your cash flow is not as high as you would like it, yes, you can absolutely liquidate a property with a full cash sale. Like any liquidation event that's going to make sense at the time, because when you're running those refinances, if you're happy with those 15 properties, but you can refinance them and take out an additional 40 grand or 30 grand or 50 grand, well, that's still tax free income. And if you're happy with the 15 and you're not buying anymore, well, now you've refinanced that 40 grand out and you can use it for the lifestyle. Like if that's your plan, you just need to build your map, like your financial map to whatever income's going to be sustainable for you and happy for you. Like, so what I like to do is write a letter to yourself and figure out what is like your dream goal of the finances. So if you know, like, okay, well, my goal is much more than 100,000. I want it to be 500,000. Well, write out a plan to yourself from the future and say, okay, here's how I came up with this 500,000, and try and visualize, okay, what is the avenue that I have to take to get to this X number that is my success number, my happiness number, my goal number, whatever you want to do. I mean, you shouldn't find your happiness in just straight cash and numbers, but like that's your satisfactory, like, okay, this is where I know I can take care of myself and my family and whoever and go from there.
A lot of people say, you shouldn't find your happiness in the money, but at the end of the day, it's just a measuring stick for the effort that was put in, right? So like, I think, like you're saying, it's very easy to look at a bank account and say, I made $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000. It's pretty hard to measure, some of those soft variables around it. But with real estate, it's really just a numbers thing, right? Money in, money out, doing all these calculations. And like you said, you got to go to the future to kind of come back to the present to figure out what are the steps reversed that I need to do to be able to get there, so that you can make those plans now, given that it's kind of a compounding effect as time goes on.
For sure. And I mean, like the reason that I always try to tell people that like money itself should never be the goal is like, I used to think it was so cliche to say like, it's not the money, it's the journey. But like when I sold my first property and I took out like $90,000 in profit, which was the most amount of money that I've ever seen and ever had in my bank account at one time, and I was absolutely freaking out. I wasn't happy about that 90,000. I was happy about the success of the project.
Right.
I was happy that I learned so much while I was doing that project, and I was able to go on to the next one because it's the growth that I enjoy. Like I would have stopped if I was happy with the $90,000, right? Like because
right.
oh, got 90 grand in the bank. That's incredible. Well, then you stop. What's the point? You do have to enjoy the growth and the plan. And like, so like, cause when I started this as an actor, I said, oh, if I could only put 10 grand in my bank account, like I'm good.
Yeah.
Now it's so silly to think about it. At the time, I was like, oh, that was the goal. But you just need to always have some other motivation versus just like X
Just
number is my motivation. Because once you hit it, you're not going to be happy anymore. Like when I had the first six figures, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to be happy when I hit $1 million in property. And when I have my multi-million in property, I'm going to be happy. Like the portfolio I have now is a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, but I'm not that much happier because of the number. I'm happier because I've learned so much and this journey's been fun. The other thing is my stress muscle has been flexed for the last 5 years. So nothing phases me on properties anymore. Like when I bought my first one, I was almost going to just sell it because I got hit with this repair bill. I was the first repair bill. I'm like, this is crazy. I'm never going to be able to afford this. But you find a way, and then you slowly over time with using that stress muscle, you can just handle so many more things. So that's the enjoyment that I personally take, not just the straight up cash. Because like I've had decent paydays, but I'm never like, oh yeah, that's good. I'm happy now.
Yeah. It's kind of that pursuit, right? The pursuit of the future. It's I think it's Matthew McConaughey. He did that good Oscar speech, right? He said something like his hero is himself in 10 years. And it's kind of like the same thing here, right? It's like you're trying to get whatever your plan is in 10 years and work back and say that I achieved that goal. Not that, oh, I put 100K in the bank or whatever the number is. It's that you're trying to do that process to build long-term wealth. So that said, what's the easiest way for someone to start with real estate? Because I know there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of methods, a lot of coaches, a lot of consultants, people, real estate agents. There's people across the board that are somewhat in one piece of the market. But how does somebody actually start to break into that space?
The easiest and best way, especially if you're just looking to start, which I always tell people, like it's depending on the age that you're starting, because it's a little bit harder if you do have a family of 5 to do it this way, but you can still make it work, is buy some sort of multifamily property at 5% or 3% down, whatever the lowest possible down payment you can do, because it compounds exponentially by just having one property. because once you have one property, you now have created 3 income sources for yourself on one property living in it. Because now you've got the mortgage pay down. Okay. So it's paying down just for you to live there. So now you're building equity for yourself. But if it's multifamily, you also have the other units paying it down, and your cost of living has gone down. If you're going to buy a duplex, your cost of living is 50% of what it would be for you to buy a single family home for yourself. So if you buy a single family home, you're still getting that equity. But if you buy a duplex, somebody else is paying for that equity. But good news, now you also are saving extra money monthly. So your cost of living has gone down by at least 50%, right? Because there's another unit that's there. So, okay, well, now it's only 50% of what it would have been. I can save that extra 50% for my next down payment. Fantastic. So that's 2 income sources right away that you've created from yourself just by living in a multifamily property. And then because it's multifamily and you get to create the value, you can force appreciation, which is another form of income from that same property. So you've actually taken 3 different sources of income from one property just by moving into it. And you've also moved into it with the lowest possible down payment of the 3% or the 5%. So when you look at ROI on a 3% investment on a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex, you cannot beat that in any investment model. You just cannot beat that. You get 3 income sources from, like I was saying, a $400,000 property for $12,000. You've now got pay down, potentially cash flow, and also appreciation on a property for $12,000. Where are you getting returns like that? And you have a place to live.
Yeah, and I think that that's the mindset that people have to be in when they start the first one, because probably to your point, there's a lot of people who know what they should be doing. They know what the steps are. They just don't actually do the steps, right? Like the math is pretty straightforward, right? Do all the steps, figure out where you want to live, house hack it if you can. If you can't, still probably buy multifamily so that the risk tolerance is a little bit better, and just keep paying it down and do the next one. The question I have is, when people start and they're doing a 3 to 5% down payment, how soon typically can they go and either cross collateralize that to go buy another property or take out another mortgage? What's that threshold, or how do you figure that out?
It all depends on the type of property that you're buying. So if your plan is growth and rapid growth, you always need to be buying a fixer upper property, like something that you need to renovate, because you need to either force the equity. When you buy a multifamily property, you can force the equity 2 ways, really. So the one way is increase the rents and increase the income of the property. So if it's in good shape and there's nothing that you can do really, and renovations wise improve the property, the only other way that you can really improve the value is increase the rents. So if it was currently rented for $600 and you can get $800 or $1,000, well, that right away on one of those units, if you can do that 2 or 3 times, you've built an additional $1,000 of income on that property. Well, now that property is shot up by whatever the cap rate is for the area, but it could be $100,000 in equity that you could build on that property right away. If you've done that, you can now access 80% of that $100,000, right? Because now if you've done that 100 grand, right away you can get either what's called a HELOC, which is a home equity line of credit, which I don't know if you've discussed on here before, or you can do just a full refinance, which I always say, if you're waiting to buy, do the HELOC. If you are going to be buying immediately and your plan is growth, do the refinance, because you get a better interest rate and you're going to be deploying the capital right away. And then the other way is through like renovations, where you're also kind of increasing the rent as well. If you can buy a really, really poor property and renovate it and make it a lot nicer and increase the rents and turn it over, well, you've also built the equity there from the renovations. And so you've forced appreciation, because some markets don't appreciate that quickly. Sometimes it's only 1 or 2%. Well, that's not enough for you to access equity and continue for you to grow your portfolio, especially if you bought in at the 3 or 5% down payment. Well, if you bought a $400,000 property and it appreciated at 2%, well, that's $8,000. You're not buying another property with $8,000. But if you were able to force the appreciation through cap rates, 100,000, now you've got 80 grand and you can buy another duplex or fourplex or whatever property it is at 400,000 with that down payment that you've got. So now you have the first one, you've taken that 80 grand out, you've bought the second one, and now you've got 2 properties which are paying down and appreciating. And of course, cash flow, obviously, what you're buying for. So that's how it compounds. Because with only 2, in a couple of years, you can refinance those again. And you can refinance both properties. And it's crazy how once you have 5 and you're running through refinances, you can buy all of a sudden 10. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. I had 5 and now I can buy 10.
Right. Yeah, it almost doubles. And it's interesting that you talk about the cap rate and the kind of growth and the percentages, because you look at inflation, at least in the US, it's like 3% per year. So if you're getting a 2% appreciation on a home, you're actually losing money unless you can take the money back out to deploy it somewhere, right? Because if the dollar's getting weaker by 3% per year and you're appreciating the house at 2% per year, are you not really just down 1%?
Well, you're all, like, that's only appreciation, but you've got the mortgage pay down as well, which is usually
Sure.
an additional mortgage pay down roughly works out, depending on what your term is and stuff, to about 2.5, 3%. So just from pay down and the appreciation
Yeah.
combined. But the other thing is you were doing that's 2% on the value of the house. That's
Right.
not 2% on the down payment, which you have invested in the house, because you're leveraged on that value of the house, right?
Right.
So even if you put down the full 20%, well, if you put down on a $400,000 home, I'm just keep going using that example because we've been talking about it. But a $400,000 home, 20% down payment is $80,000.
Right.
Well, a 2% appreciation on that is $8,000. Well, that's 10%. So
Right.
even if the inflation is 3%, you're still up 7%, right? Because
Right. Right.
inflation only actually matters on that 80 grand, not on the value of the property.
Right. And like you said, if it's on multifamily and you're forcing the value, that could really be spun into a way that you can leverage it even